What if every problem related to blood transfusions, from availability to matching to storing, could be finally solved? Thanks to a breakthrough by scientists in Japan, the creation of something once thought impossible: ready to use artificial blood cells. We live on a planet with over 8 billion people, but only 272 million units of blood are donated each year. The world needs 305 million. That's a shortfall of 33 million units every single year. That's 75,000 lives waiting, hoping, not knowing if the blood they need will ever arrive. The shocking part, 61% of countries still can't meet their own transfusion needs. England commissioned a national study just to figure out how to deal with the crisis. Regions like the Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia and Oceania face the worst of it. But now, for the first time in 400 years of transfusion history, we might finally have a way out. This is a video about how they solved it, how blood baffled scientists and physicians since the 17th century, and the global numbers that show just how serious this crisis still is. This red bag, which you commonly see during a blood transfusion, is just one of the 3 major types of blood products. And what you're looking at is called a packed red blood cell unit, or PRBC. Blood isn't just one uniform red fluid. It is made of components, each with a specific role. And when you spin blood using a centrifuge, the layers become visible. Now at the bottom is the erythrocyte layer. That's your red blood cells rich in hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen throughout the body. Floating on top is the plasma, which is made of 92% water along with proteins, hormones and clotting factors. Between them sits a thin cloudy band called the buffy coat. That's why your white blood cells and platelets, the cells that help in clotting the blood, are found. The idea that blood is made of components came much later, around the 18th to 19th century. But long before that, in the 1600s, a French physician named Jean Denis put forward one of the earliest ideas of blood transfusion, and his theories weren't backed by any science at all. At a public gathering, Denis proposed something radical: that blood alone could cure a disease. He believed that transfusing blood from a healthy person into a sick one would cleanse the body and free it from illness. And he didn't stop there. He went on to claim that animal blood was superior to human blood, because in his words, animals did not have complex emotions and were somehow more pure. Amazingly, he was allowed to test this idea. He performed 2 early transfusions using calf's blood, and both patients survived without any major side effects. But his third case would prove disastrous. Denis performed 2 transfusions on a man named Anton Moa, who was suffering from a psychological illness. His theory was that healthy blood could purify the mind and bring relief. But after the second transfusion, Anton fell seriously ill. He developed severe kidney pain, vomiting, and high fever. Shortly after, he collapsed and died. What he experienced was a classic sign of a transfusion reaction, where the body's immune system reacts against transfused blood. Sometimes it could be a fatal reaction. But at that time, due to the lack of understanding, this seemed to be just another illness. The death shook the entire medical community. Transfusions were banned in France and soon across much of Europe. And for the next 150 years, the idea of blood transfusion was almost completely abandoned. Today, most transfusions are in full blood. They are component-based. The majority of cases, about 65 to 75%, are packed red blood cells, mainly used to deal with critical bleeding or to fix anemia. The plasma, which makes up to 15 to 20% of transfusions, is used to restore blood proteins and blood volume. Scientists in Japan focused on PRBC transfusions. The early idea was simple: create free hemoglobin that can circulate in the blood and deliver oxygen directly. And here's how hemoglobin carries oxygen. This is one heme group with a ferrous ion at the center of what's called a porphyrin ring. Oxygen binds to ferrous ion reversibly without oxidizing it. And as oxygen binds to it, it makes it easier for the next ones to bind by loosening the binding site. Each hemoglobin molecule is made of 4 heme groups stabilized by globin chains. And that's how each hemoglobin carries up to 4 oxygen molecules. Hemoglobin is small, around 64 kilodaltons, which is roughly 1.06 multiplied by 10 raised to the negative 22 kilograms. And because of that, it can get filtered by the kidneys very easily. But here's the problem. Hemoglobin is safe only when inside the red blood cells. When the cell bursts or breaks down and when hemoglobin is released, it becomes free hemoglobin, thereby turning toxic. The iron inside hemoglobin shifts from ferrous state to ferric state, and what was once protected inside the cell now starts to catalyze free radical reactions, releasing toxic ions in the bloodstream. This meant that it not only loses the ability to carry oxygen but also begins to damage blood vessels, especially in the kidneys. To solve this issue, scientists knew that they had to wrap hemoglobin just like how it is wrapped inside red blood cells. But that alone wasn't enough. Recall that hemoglobin's role is to carry oxygen and carbon dioxide, which meant that the materials they use must also allow these gases to enter and exit freely. The membrane needs to be permeable but selectively to gases. So scientists began experimenting with known materials. You'd be amazed to know that this was started in 1957. They tried polymers, gums, gelatin, and even silicon. During the development, the initial goal was to try and restore blood volume, and the materials they tested were good at that. They were bulky and they helped restore fluid balance, which also helped maintaining something called as plasma osmotic pressure. As blood flows through capillaries, fluids are constantly moving in and out of tissues. But we don't want fluids leaking out uncontrollably. Instead, we want most of it to stay inside the blood vessels unless there's a specific exchange happening. And that's where plasma osmotic pressure comes in. Plasma proteins pull fluid back into the bloodstream and hold it there. When someone loses blood, they don't just lose red blood cells. Along with it, they lose these bulky proteins that maintain this pressure. The materials that scientists used helped bring the pressure back up, but they couldn't carry hemoglobin effectively. They were either too large to shrink down or they reacted badly inside the body. They needed something that could behave just like a cell. In other words, an artificial cell. In 1964, Alec Bangham, a biophysicist, was the first to visualize how lipid bilayers, just like those in cell membranes, were able to assemble themselves. What he saw would later be called liposomes. The cell membrane is usually formed with a lipid bilayer, where there's a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail. And in a cellular environment, both the exterior and the interior of the cell are fluid. Hence, the heads occupy both the outer and the inside of the cell, whereas the tail occupies the middle. Now, what liposomes are? They have a cell wall but lack other structures usually found inside a cell. They're like an empty bag into which you could stuff other molecules. Using this, scientists discovered that liposomes could safely hold hemoglobin just like red blood cells and still allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to pass across the membrane. They also found that by adjusting the liposome size and adding cholesterol into the membrane, they could stabilize the structure and add more hemoglobin safely. All they had was a package called hemoglobin vesicle. But stay with me, it gets much more interesting from here. When you donate blood, one of the major checks it goes through is blood grouping. Blood group compatibility is a major limiting factor in matching donors to patients. O positive is the most common, around 38% globally, and has the highest demand and supply. O negative is rare. Just 7% of people have it, but it's life-saving in emergencies because it can be given to almost anyone. And AB negative is ultra rare, less than 1%. Not needed often, but very hard to find when it is. Now here's an experiment to find out my blood group using the tile method. I place 3 drops of my blood on these 3 columns A and B that depict the blood group, and D predicts if it is positive or negative. And then I add what's called an anti-serum and wait for a few minutes. So here's what will happen. This is your blood and this is your plasma. Now in the blood, on the red blood cells, you have antigens. Antigen A for A blood type, B for B blood type, and no antigens if you're O, and both the antigen if you're AB. Now in your plasma, you have the reciprocal antibodies. That is anti-B for A, anti-A for B, and both anti-AB for O blood type, and no antibodies if you're AB. Now if you're positive blood type, you have an additional antigen called RH. Now in the test we performed, we added these antibodies. That is anti-A to the A column, anti-B to the B column, and anti-D to the D column. So now what this does is, this antigens react with antibodies and causes agglutination, a visible form of clumping. So if your blood type A, you'll observe agglutination in column A, if your blood type B, in column B, and if your blood type O, there'll be no agglutination. If your blood type AB, there'll be agglutination on both the columns. Now, the additional D column has the anti-D antibodies that react with the Rh antigen. So, if there's agglutination, it means it's positive blood type, and if there's no agglutination, it is negative. So, now let's have a look at the results. As you can see, there's no agglutination on A and B, it means I'm type O, and agglutination on D indicates it's O positive. Now, here's something that is really interesting. A person with O negative blood group has complete absence of antigen, which means that if they donate blood, there's nothing for the receiver's plasma antibodies to react against, and that is why O negative is the universal donor. And same way for the AB blood group, there are no antibodies in the plasma, which means the body will not react to any incoming blood, and that is why AB positive is the universal recipient. It took us 5 minutes to identify the blood group, but it took 2 years of repeated experiments for Karl Landsteiner, an Austrian-American biologist and physician, to discover the ABO blood group, for which he was awarded the 1930 Nobel Prize in Physiology. The hemoglobin vesicles created by scientists eliminated the need to match blood types before transfusion, and that's because, unlike real red blood cells, these do not have any surface antigens, which means they do not get destroyed by the recipient's antibodies. This is one of the biggest breakthroughs in the entire discovery of artificial blood. So does this mean that all the problems have been solved? Not quite. Even when blood is correctly matched and even when there's enough in stock, there's still one big issue: shelf life. Each blood component has a strict expiry window. Red cells can be stored up to 42 days, platelets just 5 to 7 days, and plasma while frozen has limits too. The global estimate stands at around 7% blood wastage annually. That translates to over a million units lost every year. Units that could potentially save close to 3 million lives. 150 years after the initial ban on transfusion across Europe, James Blundell, an obstetrician, performed the first successful human-to-human blood transfusion in 1818. He invented a specific instrument called the gravitator. Using this, the donor stands next to the receiver who lies down, and the gravitator draws blood from the donor to the receiver using nothing but gravity. This was called direct human-to-human transfusion. While the gravitator looks simple, the operator had to ensure not too much blood was drawn and that no air entered the device. Over the next few years, Blundell went on to invent a few more instruments and tubing system. And by the time he had passed away, he had accumulated wealth equivalent to 45 million pounds in today's value, all from his medical practice and the instruments he designed. For the next 100 years, direct human-to-human transfusion remained the usual way. In 1914, the period of World War I, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were severely wounded and needed immediate blood transfusions to survive. And placing two soldiers together until the transfusion was complete was not a good idea, especially on the battlefield. This called for a quick and serious alternative where the blood could be extracted, stored, transported, and transfused. This idea landed Francis Roux, a pathologist, and Joseph Turner with two major problems. As soon as blood leaves the body, it clots, and blood cannot be stored more than a few hours. They had to find a way to prevent the blood from clotting and increase the shelf life. They tried various chemicals and polymers, but none of them seemed to work. It either destroyed the cell or was toxic to the body. One day they used saccharose, a form of sugar, and it was great. It prevented the blood from being spoiled, but it still clotted. And that's when they used citrate along with saccharose, which binds to calcium and stops clotting. They combined this into a glucose citrate solution, and in 1917, an English physician, Oswald Robertson, working with the US Army in France, brought this to the battlefield as blood depot, establishing the first blood bank. The hemoglobin vesicle smartly solves the entire problem with storage. The hemoglobin placed inside the liposome is stripped of the oxygen molecule, and this prevents oxidation of Fe2+ into Fe3+. And this stops the conversion of hemoglobin to methemoglobin, which is the major reason for blood to expire since methemoglobin cannot bind to oxygen, therefore making it functionless. Finally, they added polyethylene glycol onto the surface of the liposomes. This creates structural stability and acts like a Teflon coat over the cells. This prevents clumping and deflects fluids. Now, when hemoglobin vesicles is stored at room temperature, it can be stored for 2 years. And at 4 degrees Celsius, it remains intact for 7 years. Therefore, hemoglobin vesicle solves all the major problems related with blood transfusions. Now, what hemoglobin vesicle is that it's not meant to replace human blood entirely. Instead, it is designed as a bridge therapy, which can be used to restore blood volume and oxygen levels until the patient recovers or the donated blood arrives. Once administered, hemoglobin vesicles do not circulate like red blood cells for a long time. Instead, it gets safely broken down by the spleen within 48 hours. So it is not permanent. Hemoglobin vesicles have shown very promising results in phase 1 clinical trials. And with more successful trials in the future, it could become a life-saving tool, especially in emergencies, military settings, trauma care, and disaster zones. But here's something important to remember. The hemoglobin used inside hemoglobin vesicles still come from donated blood. That means, to make artificial blood work at scale, we still need real blood donations. If just one donation of 350 to 400 ml can save up to 3 lives, wouldn't that be one of the simplest and most powerful things you could do? Your blood could save someone you've never seen or never heard of, but simply because you chose to donate.